everyone. Welcome to our second program for International Careers Week. I get to have the pleasure of introducing Maria. Maria was born in Barcelona, Spain. She speaks 5 languages, including Spanish, English, French, German, and Japanese. She has worked as a translator at the United Nations Office of Geneva since 2000. Since then, she has been translating documents that deal with human rights and climate change, among others. Welcome, Maria.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you for having me. Let's see. Before I get into what I do specifically at the UN, I thought that I would tell you a little bit about the United Nations, although I know it's quite well known. It's the world's largest international organization, as you know, and it was founded after World War II with the goal of maintaining international peace, developing friendly relations among nations, and achieving international cooperation. And today it also works on protecting human rights and delivering humanitarian aid and promoting sustainable development. Currently, it has 193 member states. And even though the main headquarters are in New York, there's offices and agencies all over the world. And I, for example, work in one of the largest ones, which is in in Geneva, Switzerland. And what I do at the UN is what you would call a language professional. And what our role at the UN is that we facilitate communication among all stakeholders, and we do it in different ways. For example, I'm a translator, which means that I receive written documents in one language, and then I translate them or I render them into my own language, which is Spanish. But I have colleagues who are interpreters, and they do that with spoken language, which means that they are in a conference hall, they hear somebody speaking, and in real time, they interpret, they translate into their own language. We're separate services, but we work, we collaborate, and our goal is the same. So just to give you a little bit of background, there are 6 official languages at the UN, and they are English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. And all language professionals need to have a main language, which is our own, our mother tongue. And then in addition, we need to have 2 other UN languages. Right. So what I was saying is that there's 6 official languages at the UN. There's English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. And all language professionals need to have one main language, which is our own language. And then in addition, they need to have very good knowledge of 2 other UN languages. In my case, I have Spanish as my main language, and then I also have French and English. And we only translate or interpret, in the case of interpreters, into our own language. And we are organized in different language sections. So I work at the Spanish translation section in Geneva. And the topics that the UN deals with in Geneva are mainly human rights, disarmament, trade and development, international law, and climate change. And every day we receive documents that have to be translated into Spanish. So this is what I do. I also do some management, but this is mainly what I do. So, regarding how I got into this career path and what inspired me to become a translator, I always liked languages and I always enjoyed writing. So I thought that studying to become a translator made sense. But I also always enjoyed following current affairs and history and politics. So after I finished my degree in translation, I studied political science. And I wasn't quite sure what my career path would be, but after I graduated, at the time I lived in the US, and I found work as a translator at the Spanish Embassy in Washington, D.C., and I liked the work. So when I moved to Geneva, Switzerland, I looked for work opportunities with the UN, and I was lucky to find temporary work. And then after a year, I had the opportunity to pass what you call the language competitive examination, which is an exam that is offered for language professionals in each of the 6 languages. There's a separate language competitive examination for interpreters and another for translators. So I took the one for Spanish translators, and I passed. And this is the path to be recruited as a staff language professional. You need to pass this exam, and it is offered about every 3-4 years, depending on how full the roster of translators is. So this is what I did.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If you guys have questions for Maria, please start typing them in. But I'm going to start off. Maria, I'm curious. How does the United Nations address language diversity to ensure effective communication and understanding among its diverse member states and stakeholders?
Right. Well, multilingualism is one of the core values of the United Nations, and because it's in recognition of how it helps facilitate multilateral communication. And in the UN Charter, which is actually a little bit like the UN Constitution, it mentions language, right? It says that the UN is to promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms without distinction as to race and sex, language, or religion. So it was always the UN's aim to be a multilingual organization. And so at conferences, the UN always offers interpretation services in all six languages, which means that, if somebody is speaking in Russian, you can put on a headset and you hear the same speech in English or in French or in Spanish or in one of the other languages. Also, documents are translated into all of the 6 languages. There's also an effort to ensure visibility for all 6 languages in all the UN websites and communications. And all over the world, UN information centers also communicate in the local languages, not just the 6 official languages. So this is what it does to ensure multilingualism. It's one of the most important things that we have at the UN.
How is the translation done? With what specific software, apps, etc.?
Well, software, we have our tools have changed a lot over the years. When I first started translating, it was, we used to dictate our translators into a microphone, into a cassette, which many of you maybe are not familiar with, and we had typist colleagues who type the translations, and we would just review the hard copies. But now we have dedicated software, which was developed by the UN, and it includes artificial intelligence. So we have machine translation in part. We also have, in the same software, it also recovers past translations, recycled text, as we call it. It also incorporates terminology. And so, it has changed a lot, and we are able to work faster now and more reliably. But it's true that sometimes our supervisors or member states expect that artificial intelligence, to be more efficient or more attuned to our work than it actually is, because some of our texts are very technical, and the artificial intelligence is not yet quite there. Mm-hmm. But technology is a big part of our work now, yes.
What is some advice for studying languages and becoming more fluent?
I'm sorry? I couldn't hear you very well.
What is some advice for studying languages and becoming more fluent?
Well, the best way to do it is to spend time abroad. To spend time abroad if you can, maybe to spend time with the family, and it's the best way to actually be imbued of the culture, be present in the country, understand, because one thing is the language, but beyond the language, there's a whole culture, how a country functions, society. So I think it's important, if you can, to spend some time in a country. Otherwise, of course, nowadays you can study on your own, but being in a group also helps. And in-person lessons, if you can find them, they're also helpful. And sometimes if you can't go abroad, you can surely find a person who speaks the language wherever you are, and you can have exchanges and have one-on-one conversation with that person. So that's also another great way to do it.
Has anything ever gone wrong because of misinterpretation?
Well, yes. Yes, that's something that happens, indeed. Can I think of a specific example? Yes, I mean, I can think of a specific example of, in climate change, one very sensitive document was mistranslated, and France protested and asked for it to be issued again. It happens sometimes. Recently, some Latin American countries, and also I believe Canada, have requested that the expression indigenous peoples be capitalized in all documents. And they requested that some documents where it had not been capitalized be reissued again. Yeah, there's always cases like that, because we work with politically sensitive documents, and it happens all the time. Member states look at what we wrote, and if they're not happy with it, there's sometimes complaints, and we have to reissue the documents. Interpreters, it's different, because for translators, when you get a text, you have more time to do it maybe, but it has to be really right. And interpretation is more fluent, because interpreters are just speaking, and if they realize that they have made a mistake, they can just say, oh, by the way, when I said this, actually I meant that. So it's a little bit more fluid. It's not quite, this comma has to be here, and this punctuation has to be perfect. It's a little bit different.
We have a student that is incredibly interested in international law. Have you done a lot of translation work with international lawyers? And could you maybe give some advice on a student looking to go into international law?
Mm-hmm. Well, we translate documents for the International Law Commission. The International Law Commission does very important work at the UN. And so, yeah, I mean, studying law and the law degree would be the path to go. I don't, personally translate international law documents, but yeah, I have colleagues who have a legal background, who have studied law, and who specialize in the International Law Commission, and it's quite exciting. They translate their reports. Sometimes they get to go to their conferences and follow the negotiations a little bit. So yeah, it's a great it's an interesting path, because lawyers are in high demand in the translation field, because we have a lot of legal documents.
For students interested in a career in language translation for international organizations, what language skills and educational background would you recommend?
Well, of course, they need to have a strong. I mean, of course, I would advise them to study languages. They need to have a strong background in languages, and so a university degree in languages would seem like the logical path, but it's not the only path. It's not a requirement. You need to have a university degree, but it can be in other fields, because eventually we all specialize, and a degree in international relations, or in the law, in economics even, or even in the science, as long as you have those strong language skills is a good way to go as well. You need to have an open mind. You need to be curious. Throughout your career as a translator, you will have to acquire a lot of knowledge on the activities that the UN pursues, and often it needs to be quite broad. You can translate something as different as human rights, law, climate change. So you really need to have a good, solid understanding of how the world works, and be curious and follow current affairs. That's important.
What is the pay like for your job?
It's good. It's not bad. It's good. I'm happy.
How did you learn your second and third languages, and what made you interested in your current position?
I grew up in a bilingual area in Spain. In Barcelona, we speak two languages. We speak Spanish and another Latin language called Catalan. And my mother was also a French teacher, so I kind of grew up speaking three languages. And that kind of helps, if you learn languages as a child, that helps you. So then later I studied English, but still as a child. And later on I added other languages that I master less well, German or Japanese I don't speak so well, but if you can start young, it's great. But it's never too late to learn a language. In fact, at the UN, as translators, we're encouraged to add other languages later on in life. And I know people who have learned, as adults, languages as difficult as Arabic or Russian or even Chinese. So it just depends on your interest and your commitment, and you can definitely do it.
Do you ever get confused and mix languages together?
Sometimes when I speak, I can't find a certain expression, or I can't find a word, and I need to, to think a little bit, or maybe I will have some interferences, especially with the languages that are closest to each other. For example, with Spanish and Catalan, which are quite similar, sometimes I might say, one word and I meant in another in the other language. But in writing, that happens less, because in writing, you're kind of concentrating in a different way. And in speaking, you're more spontaneous, and it tends to happen a bit more. Than in
How many
writing.
hours does a UN translator work each day?
About 8 hours. About 8 hours. So, I usually, on a regular day, I'll start at 9 in the morning and I'll finish at around 6 p.m. And, we spend a lot of time in front of the computer and thinking about how should I translate this? How should I do that? You spend time at meetings as well, or discussing, different topics with colleagues. It's quite varied, but you need to like to write, and you need to be interested in all these different topics. So that's about it. Yeah.
Do you work remotely, or do you have to go into an office? Is there any travel?
I work to the office. I go to the office 3 days a week, and I work from home 2 days a week. And I do travel occasionally, not very often. Interpreters do travel a lot more than translators, because translators can submit their translation, remotely. But when there's important conferences, or politically sensitive, something that's a bit special, like for the Paris Agreement on climate change, then we do travel, and we go to the conference and we work right there. So that's fun. We don't get to do that often, but when we do, that's fun.
How do you apply for or get a job like this?
I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
How do you apply for or get a job like this?
How do you apply for it? Well, as I said, the first thing you do is you apply to take the competitive examination. I can share some resources later, some links to websites that maybe students might be interested in. So when you see that there's the opportunity to take the competitive examination, there's a way of submitting your application, and if it's accepted, you can take the examination. And if you pass the examination, then you're placed in a roster for translators, and the UN recruits from this roster. So you might be called to go to work, cover a vacancy in New York, in Vienna, Austria, in Geneva, Switzerland, or in Nairobi, Kenya, or in one of the regional commissions, for example, in Santiago, in Chile, or in Bangkok, places like that. There's also occasionally examinations for temporary translators, not just for staff translators. And those examinations would be advertised as well. And then you would be placed in a roster to have like short-term contracts. This happens as well. So
are indigenous communities involved with the UN?
Yes, indigenous communities are indeed involved with the UN, and we they are, there's the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, and their knowledge and their sensitivity is an important element that's taken into account in negotiations at the UN, and their point of view is valued, and more it is so, because the UN believes that they have something to bring to the table that's different, and that it's a different perspective that needs to be cherished and valued. For example, in climate change, they have a way of dealing with change, with nature, that is different from maybe what the Western approach is. So it's very much valued. And there are conferences that they attend, and specifically to get their perspective.
Do you know if these indigenous communities are from all countries or from the US?
They are from all countries. Some of them are from the US, also obviously from Latin America, from Australia, from Canada, from even from Europe. There's indigenous communities in the Scandinavian countries, and also in Africa. So yes, there's indigenous communities all over the world. Their perspective is valued and cherished. Yeah.
How could one represent the indigenous community?
Well, that's I imagine that the best way to do that would be through one of the NGOs that are represented at the UN and that have contact with the UN. So I would encourage whoever would be interested in that to find out what in their area, what non-governmental organizations are in touch with the UN or have consultative status or approved status with the UN, and this would be the best way, just to to participate with civil society, with indigenous organizations.
Can you share a memorable experience or project where language translation played a critical role in facilitating successful communication at the UN?
Well, one exciting moment for me was when we translated the Paris Agreement on climate change, and this was in Paris in 2015, and it was one of the occasions where we were able to travel to the conference and to work right there, and it was exciting to see negotiations. It was a big conference. There were a lot of high-profile, politicians, heads of state, like Barack Obama was there. There were, a lot of interesting people to hear. And then our work was very exciting because we could see that we were achieving something new. For the first time, there was going to be a global agreement on climate change that generated more consensus than the previous one, which was the Kyoto Protocol. And it was very exciting to be there when finally the gavel went down and we could see that our work was actually meaning something, and people were waiting for the language versions so they could read the agreement and they could negotiate and see, if this was something that member states were agreeing with. So it was very exciting to be part of that.
In your experience, what are some unique challenges faced by language translators in a diplomatic and international setting, and how do you overcome them?
Well, there's different challenges that we have. One of them is that our work needs to have a high quality standard, and at the same time, we cover a very broad range of subjects. So even if we specialize in different topics, we're still required to be able to translate text from different areas. And it's important to use the right terminology for each area. And so we need to follow all the guidelines, internal UN guidelines, for example, on gender inclusive language or on disability inclusive language. Another challenge, like I was mentioning before, has to do with the political sensitivity of documents, and we must find solutions that different member states will agree with. For example, there's an archipelago off the coast of Argentina that's called the Falkland Islands. They belong to the UK, but Argentina feels that they should be called Islas Malvinas. They have a different name. So, you need to know in each document which term you should use, and it's very sensitive. You need to use it correctly. Or another challenge is to find the right nuance in documents. For example, recently in a climate change decision, we had to translate this phrase, which meant transitioning away from fossil fuels. And we knew that, in Spain, in France, the press was waiting to see, okay, how are you going to say this in Spanish? You need to get it right, not too strong, not too weak. So we had to discuss how to find the right nuance. You always have to find the right register and tone for a language, for a text, that it's not too colloquial, or sometimes it needs to be a little bit more spontaneous or colloquial. Sometimes it has to be very formal. So those are the challenges we usually encounter.
How do you decide how to phrase translations due to some languages or phrases not having a direct translation?
Well, all languages use phrases. So what you need. The challenge is to keep to the meaning of the original language, but to render it naturally to your own language. So if in English the text uses a phrase like any kind of expression, you need to find. You cannot translate word for word. You need to find the right expression that means the same thing in your language. Like in English, if it says it's raining cats and dogs, I cannot say that in Spanish because people will say, what? It doesn't mean anything. I have to find an idiom that in Spanish that means the same thing. So this is a challenge, right? Because sometimes idioms are very specific, and you need to, that's why it's important to understand the culture, not just the language word for word. You need to know, okay, this expression means this, but it has this other nuance, and how do I say it in my own language? It's not always easy.
How does the United Nations support the professional development and growth of language translators? And what opportunities exist for individuals in this field to contribute to global diplomacy and cooperation?
Well, the UN does support the professional development of translators. We have many training opportunities. We have 5 days of mandatory training per year. So that's mandatory. But besides that, we have a lot of training opportunities throughout the year on how to use new tools, on any of the subject matters that we deal with. For example, we have courses on compared criminal law, or on climate change, or on disarmament, technology. And so we take advantage of those. Also, if we want to add a new language, we have the opportunity of taking those language classes. And our contribution to global diplomacy, I guess, it's how we facilitate the intergovernmental process, or how we facilitate understanding between all member states and all stakeholders. And sometimes we do it, quietly from our office, and sometimes we do it, more visibly from a conference, if we're lucky enough to travel and to attend a conference. But that's how we do it. Yeah.
You've touched on this a little bit, but I want to ask the question again. What advice do you have for students interested in pursuing a career in language translation for international organizations, and what steps can they take to build relevant skills and experiences?
Mm-hmm. Well, the advice I have is, of course, to study languages. If they can, to spend some time abroad, to learn not just the language, but the culture, to be very curious about the world and the political context, to learn about the UN and its work. If they study translation, they'll get good practice in translating. But you can also find work as a volunteer, translating pro bono for an NGO, or even the UN has a volunteer program where you can, pro bono practice and do translations for them. And you have to, you can prepare to take the language competitive examination, and those are the things that I would do. Work on your languages, strengthen your languages. If you can, travel and go abroad. If you can't, exchange with friends. And then these practice translations or volunteering for an NGO, or for the UN, that's a good way to do it as well. And don't limit yourself to the languages. You need to have a good understanding, political understanding of the world, little history, political, international relations. All of those backgrounds are valuable for that kind of work.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. That's about all the time we have. I just want to say thank you to our sponsors at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Humanities Montana, Stockman Bank, and Clearwater Credit Union, and our good friends at the World Language Initiative of Montana, which is located in Bozeman, Montana. Thank you so much, Maria.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.